income differences?
I think it's quite clear that when the gap opens up between the very rich and the rest of us, it does hurt us. The rich don't live in a separate universe. They are part of our society. So part of it is that they set standards of consumption through their wealth that then people see, people aspire to. Those a little bit below the super rich feel a little less satisfied with what they have. And there's a sort of cascade of consumption and material aspiration that happens there. Also, I think when the rich become super rich, they start to see themselves as different to the rest of us, and they want not to be part of our society. So we see the rise of gated communities, people trying to set themselves off from society, wanting to live in tax havens, send their children to very expensive schools, create a more exclusive world. And again, that creates divisions and segregation in society rather than cohesion and togetherness.
We can say that 90 or 95% of the population seem to do better in more equal countries. And what I mean by that is that if we, on the incomes we have now and with the education and the jobs we have now, if we had that same individual income, same job, same education, and we lived in a more equal country, we would live a little bit longer. Our children would probably do a little bit better at school. We'd be less likely to become victims of violence. Our children would be less likely to get involved in drugs or to become teenage parents. In that sense, we all do better in a more equal society. The differences are biggest at the bottom, so inequality makes most difference to the poor, but at the top even, there's a small advantage in being in a more equal society.
The other important thing is that we find that even for those in the top stratum of society, whether it's the highest paid or the best educated, for those people in a more equal society, their health and well-being is better too. Their children are less likely to drop out of school or have drug problems. And so the benefits of greater equality do seem to be there for the vast majority of the population. So not only are the rich perhaps causing damage to the rest of society unknowingly, but also are cutting themselves off from the benefits of a better society.
There are perhaps 50 studies showing that violence is reliably more common in societies with bigger income differences. It's been measured in a great many different settings. The reason why that pattern seems to exist is not because the poor start to attack the rich. The violence is primarily amongst the poor, but it seems to be a response to the social status becoming more important, looking up to some people, looking down on some people. And if you are deprived of access to good housing and jobs and cars and all the signs of ability and success, you get very sensitive to how you're seen and judged. And if you feel people are disrespecting you, and you haven't got the education and jobs to give you self-esteem and dignity, the one way I can make you respect me is to hit you. I remember reading a quote from an American in prison who had said, "It's amazing how much respect you get from someone when you're holding a gun to their head."
Vi har fler våldsskadade än vad vi har blindtarmsinflammationer, än vad vi har astmapatienter, än vad vi har diabeteskomplikationer. Alltså det är en jättestor patientgrupp. Alltså utifrån våra studier som vi nu har kunnat följa sedan 1987 så ser man ju förändringar. På 2000-talet har det hänt väldigt mycket. Några stora bitar, det är att det har gått ner i åldrarna både bland offer och gärningsmän. Alltså det här med allt från 10-åringar upp till 17-åringar, det är en grupp som aldrig fanns före år 2000. Idag är de över 16% från att vara 8% år 2000. Så det är en fördubbling där, och det har lett till att många andra faktorer förändras. Det är fler gärningsmän på ett offer, man använder oftare och oftare vapen och tillhyggen av olika slag för att inte riskera att få stryk själva. En annan viktig sak som vi kan se i statistiken, det är just att väldigt mycket av våldet riktas mot huvud och ansikte. Och just gatuvåldet så är ju ofta gärningsmännen väldigt okända, och de är väldigt många. Och sparkar en så vill alla andra sparka också. Och det ser man att sparkar, det var 7% av våldsskadorna före år 2000, och idag så är de 49%. En sån här skada som att få en spark i skrevet, det har slitit av pulsådern i pungen, och han har nu ett sånt högt tryck i pungen att det har pressat blod ända upp till navelplan under huden. Trycket är så högt här så det finns inte plats för pulsådrorna att röra sig, så att de stannar. Här kan man ju säga att det måste till en hel del tur för att man ska överleva. Men det är ju tack vare att kniven sitter kvar i bröstet som en kork som han har överlevt. Hade någon dragit bort den här kniven, då hade han varit död på 3 hjärtslag. En annan väldigt markant förändring under 2000-talet, det är att det har blivit vanligare och vanligare att flickor tar efter pojkars beteende och börjar slå andra flickor. Men flickor har alltså gått upp från 8% år 2000, och nu i fjol så är det 20,8% av totalantalet gatuvåldsskadade.
People have always seen a sort of contradiction between, and it's often talked about as God and Mammon, between material wealth and what is good and right. I think it's quite useful to see that in terms of whether you're motivated by desire for status and money and so on, or whether you're motivated by a more intrinsic interest in what you do. And of course, the bankers getting those huge bonuses, they started to be pretty bad bankers, you know, not really understanding and thinking about the risks adequately. They were motivated by wanting these huge bonuses. In students, we see it in terms of kids wanting just to get a good mark without a genuine interest in the subject they're doing. And so I think that when life is seen to be about money and status, that conflict between the extrinsic and intrinsic motivation increases. The conflict that people have so often expressed in terms of between God and Mammon increases.
When we were looking at child well-being, we found something really interesting, which at first we had to sort of grapple with and try to understand. We found that children in more equal societies did better in education, so they were scoring higher on these international tests. They were less likely to drop out of school. So it looked as if kids did better in school in more equal societies. But on a measure of children's aspirations, you know, when children were asked about the kinds of jobs they wanted to do, we found that aspirations were lower in more equal societies. And so at first that felt like a worrying finding, and so we had to sort of think that through. And then we realized that actually in the societies where children were doing best educationally, they didn't obviously feel the need to say, I want to be a celebrity, or I want to be famous, or I want to be rich. And in the societies where they were doing least well, so in America, in other very unequal societies, where lots of kids drop by the wayside, they don't finish school, they don't get any qualifications. In those societies, children were more likely to actually have high aspirations. And so when you put those two things together, it's actually very sad, because the aspirations are highest where they are least likely to actually be achieved. And maybe that's because in more equal societies, all kinds of contributions are valued. So it's all right for a child to say, actually, I would like to be a craftsperson, or I would like to be a nursery nurse, or I'd like to be a teacher. You know, that those kinds of contributions to society are valued. And yet in a society where money is everything and status is everything, then all the kids want to be a celebrity. They want to be a basketball star or a model, or yes, they want to sing and win a talent competition. And of course, the opportunities for children to fulfill themselves through those routes are minuscule. And so I suspect that there's a lot more disappointment for children, and a lot more of being unable to fulfill your aspirations in more unequal societies. And I think that's desperately sad when we think about that among our young people.
In a way, I think there's an important issue when people talk about people at the bottom being weak and reliant on the state and so on, a failure to ask what makes people weak. How important the processes we've talked about around social status, around the stresses, the worries about how you're seen and judged, the effects of being looked down on are. And of course, again and again, people emphasize the need for monetary stimulus to initiative and so on, saying that surely the inequality encourages people to make more effort to get up. But actually, if you think about it, the making more effort to get up is making more effort to overcome the obstacles that inequality creates. So the inequality sets up the obstacles, and then people say, oh, it's a good thing because it creates a stimulus to overcome the obstacles. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, I think competition is always in conflict with cohesion and collectivism, and markets are about competition. So that if we are striving to compete for ourselves or for our company, to increase market share, to increase profits for shareholders, that necessarily sets companies against one another, people within companies against one another. I think it's naturally destructive of our more collective tendencies. When we were thinking about doing some research on different kinds of employee democracy and health, Richard actually went to visit some companies where the employees had bought the company. And